Dear colleagues, good morning. My name is Mike Schäfer, and I was kindly invited by the organizers of this panel to give an introductory keynote presentation. I'm a professor of science communication. I'm a communication scientist at the University of Zurich. And so what I thought I should do with this presentation is give you an overview over the field that I'm working in as far as it relates to climate change. So I'll be talking today about a communication science perspective on climate change communication. It's going to be an overview. It's not going to be that much about my personal research, but I thought it would be more interesting for you to get a sense of what this field is actually doing and where you may or may not be able to connect to it. And with that, I'll switch over here to my presentation, share the screen with you, and then we can get started. So the talk is titled, as I told you, Research on Climate Change Communication, a Communications Perspective. And I thought, first of all, it would be useful to give you a sense of the research field or the part of the research field on climate change communication that I'm working on. And that is research on mediated climate change communication, which is important, first of all, as you know, because climate change is an important issue. Of course, it's one of the crucial challenges that we as mankind or humankind have to face currently. But it's also what we call an unobtrusive issue. It is, or for many people, it seems, it appears to be abstract. It is complex. It seems to be detached from the personal life world, from the biographical horizons, because climate change is often described on large temporal or large geographical scales. And for such issues, for unobtrusive issues, climate change is not the only example that exists. For such issues, we know as a field that mediated communication is important, because the media, and the media means news media, means legacy media, but also means nowadays, of course, online media and social media. They are important sources for what many people actually know and learn and how they come in contact with issues like climate change. And the Newman et al. Study that I've quoted you there is the Digital News Report by the University of Oxford, who for 40 countries have shown that media are crucial sources for climate change communication as far as the broader public is concerned. And this importance of mediated climate change communication has also meant that there's a research field that has emerged in the 90s, about 25 years ago. And this field has grown considerably. Maybe one indicator is that the Oxford Encyclopedia on Climate Change Communication that was published 2 years ago already contains 150 review articles, each reviewing a whole field within research on mediated climate change communication. So it's a big field. It's a very interdisciplinary field. So there's communication scholars like me, sociologists, geographers, psychologists, political scientists, and others. And worth noting also is that the field has a strong focus certainly on Western countries, but specifically on Anglophone countries, the US, Australia, the UK. This is worth keeping in mind. If you want to get a short or longer overview over the field, a short entry point could be the entry on climate change and the media in the International Encyclopedia of the Social and Behavioral Sciences. There is, as I told you, this Oxford Encyclopedia, 3 volumes, a big project on climate change communication. And there is this journal here, the widely interdisciplinary reviews on climate change, a journal that specializes in review articles about climate science, climate change, not just about communication, but also about communication, worth checking out. And in talking about climate change communication today, or mediated climate change communication, I will focus on 3 aspects, 3 steps of it. First, on how this communication is produced, then on its content characteristics, and then on the audience perspective. So let's first look at the production side of things. The general perspective here is, or the guiding research questions of this field are, well, first, how, and how means with what messages, for what reasons, why, with what motivations, where and what channels. So how do stakeholders like politicians, corporations, scientists, NGOs, etc., communicate on climate change? And relatedly, how do intermediaries like journalists traditionally, but nowadays also new intermediaries like bloggers and influencers on social media, or tech intermediaries like social media platforms that algorithmically curate climate change related content. So how do these intermediaries select and portray climate change related content? And methodologically, that's a field or part of the field where we often have qualitative case studies with interviews and document analysis, sometimes observational techniques for certain stakeholders. We have a little bit of survey work, so standardized questionnaires, some experimental work, and we have manual and automated content analysis of stakeholder content and social media. And I wanted to give you some takeaways from this research, and I'll do this for all 3 steps, and you will see that these takeaways are very, very sketchy. There's a lot of gaps. There's not much detail. There can't be much detail for reasons of time. And my worried suspicion is that for many of these things, some of you will know better and certainly in more detail than what I will present here. But let's give it a try. Production, some takeaways from this research. First of all, what we've seen is that science is not the major player in public communication about climate change. Especially that there are studies, for example, about the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which for a long time certainly didn't communicate well about climate change to the public. That means they were geared towards the scientific audience and of course towards political decision makers, but public communication was not the strong suit of the IPCC, and there's a number of studies that show this quite convincingly. It's gotten better now, but it wasn't the strong suit. There is, of course, intense communication of selected scientists. There are some people, some scientists who very actively communicate to the public, who do it on various channels and who do it very well, and who also are willing to engage in sometimes more controversial aspects of the communication. Like the best example in Switzerland is probably Reto Knutti from ETH. So there are these scientists doing that, but many scientists, climate scientists, actually don't. And for the scientists that do it, there are studies also showing that partly they do adopt to what has been called a media logic. So they adapt to what they think the news media, what would appeal especially to the news media, etc. So they partly also use, and that's not, I'm not talking about Reto Knutti here, they partly use strategic communication also, like other actors would do as well. Then there's quite a lot of research on NGOs and social movements like Greenpeace, like environmental NGOs like Greenpeace, the WWF, etc., but also social movements like Fridays for Future or Extinction Rebellion, even though there's not that much research yet. And as you can already see in my examples, NGOs and social movements concerned with climate change are extremely diverse in their organizational structure, in their aims and their strategies, but they have been early adopters of climate change as an issue, as a topic. And on this issue, they're siding with the science, which is not a given, because on other issues like genetic engineering, biotechnology, environmental NGOs do not side with the science. They're the opponents there, but on climate change, they do side with the science. They do side with the mainstream consensus view on the science, and they are strong users of online and social media, which they use to inform people, but especially also to mobilize people. And they did have a strong mobilizing success recently, and that's Fridays for Future is a very good example, which was to a major part mobilized for via social media and online media. But a mobilizing success also that was, and we'll get back to that when we talk about content, that was halted to an extent by the coronavirus or by the pandemic that we are currently in. There's quite a bit of research on denialists, even though it has to be said there are considerable country differences here. Both in the research and in the actual situation when it comes to denialists. What we do have is an elaborate, what Dunlap and McCry, two PR researchers, have called a climate change denial machine or climate denial machine. So a machinery funded by corporations, by conservative foundations, funding think tanks that produce pseudoscience, essentially masking itself as real science, sowing doubt about climate change, that is represented by front groups and by seeming social movements and NGOs. So there's this elaborate climate denial machine that has been studied and focused on and described academically quite extensively, especially in countries like the US, and by extension then in Australia and in the UK and otherwhere. That is also shown, for example, that they have focused very strongly on what they call the uncertain science frame. So sowing doubt about the underlying science still happens sometimes. But what now has become more important is sowing doubt about the actual measures that people can take. So about the economic costs, for example, of changing course and actually trying to fight climate change. And they also, at least partly, these denialists, intensely use social media and sometimes very professionally use social media and partisan outlets like Fox News in the US, or like the Rupert Murdoch, many of the Rupert Murdoch newspapers in many English-speaking countries. And when we look at journalists, when we look at intermediaries, I have to say, we don't have much research actually on tech intermediaries like platforms and algorithmic curation of climate change communication. And we don't also have that much research on influencers, bloggers, people active on social media, but we do have a lot of research on journalists, on environmental journalists, on climate journalists. And this research describes a pronounced crisis of journalism in general, which has trouble attracting audiences and especially getting advertisement revenue. And this crisis of journalism in general affects environmental and specialist and climate journalism in particular. So in many countries, journalism, and especially climate journalism, science journalism, environmental journalism, is in crisis, has less resources, has less manpower, has less time to deal with more information that's coming in and that has to be presented on more channels. And what that means for the quality of journalism, you can imagine. If you actually do look at the climate journalists that exist, there's a number of studies showing, for example, that especially in countries beyond the Anglophone world, many climate journalists subscribe to the IPCC frame, the IPCC view of things, especially in Western quality media. So they try to present the scientific consensus. But there is, for example, sometimes a conflict between journalistic values and the inherent logic of climate change. Balance as bias is probably the most well-known example, which is the tension between the journalistic value of balanced reporting, which comes from political reporting, where you have the norm that if you present one political take on things, you should present the other side as well. And often that has been extended to climate change reporting. But the problem there is if you say, well, okay, we have a scientist here presenting the mainstream view of science, and then you say, well, okay, we have to balance it, so we have to have another view here. That means that you actually misrepresent the scientific consensus. And what you're talking about there is obviously not a matter of opinion, it's a matter of facts. And if you misrepresent the facts, then this norm of balance actually becomes a bias in reporting. And that's a problem that a number of media have tried to address, like the BBC in the UK or the Guardian also in the UK, that have specifically decided not to do this balanced reporting when it comes to climate change anymore. Okay, let's skip to the second part of my research overview, which is the content side. And the basic question here is, well, how are the characteristics, the causes, the impacts, but also the potential remedies for climate change? How are they portrayed in or discussed in news media, in online media, in social media? And what we do here as a field is we do some variant of content analysis. We analyze obviously content, so it's texts or videos or pictures or something like that. And we do this qualitatively or quantitatively. We do this automatedly or semi-automatedly. We use computational network analysis for social media data. And there's colleagues also using discourse analysis, which focus more on the power structures in public communication, or linguistic analysis, which focus more on language structures in public communication. And again, some takeaways from this research. First of all, what we see is a rise in coverage about climate change around the world pretty much since the mid-2000s. A good place to have a look at that is this project here, which is done by Max Boykoff at the University of Boulder in Colorado. And what Max Boykoff and colleagues are doing there is for every month and continuously, they're selecting 120 media over 50 countries, I think, and map in how far, to what extent they cover climate change. And what you can see here is that its coverage has risen since the mid-2000s. And what you can't really see here, what you have to believe me, is it's especially risen in countries that are affected by what I've called here the secondary, the socioeconomic effects of climate change. So countries who have to change their national economy, who are hit by reducing greenhouse gas emissions because their national industry is very fossil fuel heavy, etc. Australia is the core example here that produces a lot of coal, exports a lot of coal, etc. So the countries with most climate change coverage actually have been shown to be these countries hit by the secondary effects, not so much the countries hit by the primary effects, by extreme weather events or droughts or changing ecosystems, because these are often countries in the global south that have a number of issues to deal with, not just climate change, that don't cover climate change then that prominently sometimes. What you can also see is that climate change coverage is very strongly event-driven. There's a number of events, like here, end of 2009, that's the Copenhagen Climate Summit. And that also already indicates, or here, the Paris Climate Summit, that already indicates that the most prominent events that often get coverage here are the conferences of the parties to the UNFCCC. So it's the World Climate Summits like Copenhagen, like the Paris Summit, that receive most of the attention. If you look at the coverage in terms of content, what is actually written there, what you can see in many countries over the past years is what has been called a societal turn, which means that the science of climate change is actually receiving less coverage. When you look at coverage tackling climate change in general, what receives more coverage or more attention are the impacts on society and the socio-political options for action. So there's a societal turn here. What people have also shown is that visualizations internationally seem to be very similar. If climate change is visualized in the media, it's often infographics, it's impact imagery. So it's the drought, or it's the extreme weather event, or it's the ice bear, the polar bear on the ice shelf, or it's talking heads. So politicians or celebrities speaking. What you can see are persisting country differences in the presence of skeptics, of denialism, with significantly more of them being present in the media of Anglophone countries. And what you can see is a crowding out, I've mentioned it before, of the topic of climate change due to the coronavirus. And I actually have an example here from Switzerland, a recent study from the FÖG, which is a research center here at the University of Zurich, has done actually a study on the coronavirus, on how media cover the coronavirus. And what you can see in this slide here is how in the 3 different linguistic regions in Switzerland, how much of the entire media coverage, they've analyzed 40 some media outlets, how much of these media outlets' entire coverage was concerned with with coronavirus. And you can see it was up to 70% at some stage, a huge amount in all linguistic regions. And I'm showing you this, it's interesting here, because the yellow line at the very bottom, that's their reference point. And that's climate coverage. And you can see that it almost flat lines down there. Even though it had much more coverage before, it's crowded out by the topic of coronavirus. So, third part of my presentation, let's look at the audiences. And the perspective here is twofold, essentially. First, it's the question of, well, who uses what kind of climate change related content, who's actually using what media mediated climate change communication, and well, what effects does this have? Effects on the audience's knowledge, on their attitudes, on their emotions, for example, their worry about climate change, or on their behavior, on their political behavior, on consumer behavior, etc., etc. What we do here as a field in this to tackle these questions are mostly surveys and experiments, lab experiments, online experiments. some computational analysis and social media, also some qualitative analysis. I have to hurry up a little bit, I think. So again, some takeaways from this research. What we can see is that news media are still relevant and trusted and also widely shared in social media and online media, widely shared sources of information about climate change. But their effects, the effects of news media coverage on climate change, should not be overestimated, because they are often used by specific people. So, for example, the people reading about climate change in quality media are a specific kind of people who are often already convinced that climate change exists and is a problem and don't need to be further convinced. And the people that you would like to convince, again, you wouldn't reach with these kinds of media. I'll get back to that later. Another aspect of that is that the effect of information and of communicating the science about climate change are limited, because often you don't reach the right people because they're not interested in the science and it's difficult to convey the science of them. But also if you try to convince people who are convinced that the science is wrong, it doesn't work to just bombard them with more information about the science, which is due to phenomena I can't go into here, like cultural cognition and motivated reasoning. And some of you are actually doing research on, I know. So it's not that easy to just use information to change people's minds. What are useful strategies, for example, is to anchor the unobtrusive issue of climate change in people's life worlds. So to give people a sense of, well, what does this have to do with you? Where does it occur? Where are traces of climate change in your life? How do people similar and close to you probably deal with this issue, etc.? That's useful to anchor the issue in people's lives. And it's also useful to emphasize what people can gain by changing their behavior or by tackling climate change, instead of what actually often happens, instead of emphasizing what they will lose if they don't change their behavior. So emphasize gain frames instead of loss frames is a well-working strategy. And an interesting strand of research is research focusing on how can you deal with, how can you counter potentially misinformation. There's John Cook and Stefan Lewandowski are very good, two very good colleagues from the UK and the US in that respect. And the debunking handbook you can download freely online, which I can recommend. And they do research, for example, on inoculation. So trying to figure out, and it seems to work to an extent, well, is it working if you give people a sense of how do denialists, how do people giving you misinformation, how do they usually argue? What are their strategies? How does this misinformation actually work? And if people know the strategies like cherry picking, they can recognize these strategies in misinformation and are less prone to just adopt it. Okay, and I wanted to show you one more aspect before I wrap up of audience research, which is that in many countries, people have figured out that there is actually not one big audience, it's one big monolithic homogeneous audience. We actually have to talk about different audiences because people have varying attitudes to climate change. And scholars have often then done segmentation analysis trying to figure out, well, there's this diverse overall audience, but they've tried to use methodological strategies trying to sort the audience into groups that are homogeneous in their attitudes towards climate change and try to figure out, well, people with this kind of attitude towards climate change, well, what's their media diet? How can I reach them? How do they think? How can I tackle them, actually? And I brought you an example from Australia here to illustrate that. Coming from the Monash Climate Change Communication Research Hub, which is a good center, not only doing research, but trying to make the research impactful. I'll show you in a second. What they've done, for example, is reconstructed these global warmings, what they call 5 Australias. So they've tried to reconstruct how do the Australians think about climate change. And what you can see here is that 26% of Australians are alarmed already about climate change. 39% are at least concerned, whereas on the other side of the spectrum, 12% are doubtful. So they are on the brink towards denialism probably. Oh, sorry. And 9% are already there. They are dismissive. They don't think climate change exists, or it's that big of a problem, or it's not worth doing something about it. And they try to do two things with that. First of all, they try to develop target-specific communication strategies to target these specific audiences. Because, for example, if you look at the alarmed and the concerned segment, they already accept the science and they know a lot about it. Whereas if you try to use the science to communicate, it's difficult with the doubtful and the dismissive because they don't believe in the science. And they also have different information diets. You reach them in different places and in different media if you want to reach them. And the second thing they want to do, apart from these target-specific messages, is they want to try out kind of what they call non-persuasive climate change communication. So they want to do what Ed Maybach in the US has described as, well, using simple, clear messages, repeated often by a variety of trusted sources. So the Australian colleagues have figured out that, well, via surveys that, well, weather presenters are very trustworthy in the Australian public. So they asked many weather presenters in Australia if they would be willing to portray climate information in their weathercasts. And many would. And then they asked audiences if they would actually be interested in watching that, in climate information or weathercasts. And the audiences also would. So what the Monash Research Hub actually tries to do now is provide weather presenters with very simple trend information about weather trends. Like this. So there's a warm day in June, and the weathercaster is saying, well, look, today it's quite warm here. And if you look at the trend over the last 40 years, or 50 years in this case, you can see that the number of warm days in June has actually gone up over time. And she doesn't even mention climate change there. But across Australia, different weather stations, people see these trends and get a sense of, well, things seem to be changing, and maybe that's climate change. But climate change is not really mentioned in the weathercast itself. And this initiative is then flanked by an impact assessment study that the colleagues are doing, where they try to figure out, well, after 1.5 years time, do people regularly watching these weathercasts actually have changed their attitudes and maybe their behavior towards climate change? And also comparing this with a control group of people not watching these weathercasts. So wrapping up, what I wanted to show you and to take away from this is, well, there's this pronounced rise in research attention for climate change communication with a clear pluralization of research. If we look at communicators, we've seen that there's an increase and also a pluralization of strategic communication about climate change. When we look at intermediaries, we have this sustained crisis of journalism with pronounced effects for climate journalism. If we look at content, we have a rise in media attention since the mid-2000s, a societal turn, societalization of content, but also a crowding out due to the corona situation. If we look at uses, we have seen that audiences are very different with different attitudes, different media diets. So it's hard to find a one-size-fits-all solution for climate change communication. And in terms of effects, what I've tried to show you is that, well, we have more long-term than short-term effects. We probably, if we talk about mediated climate change communication, also have more cognitive than attitudinal and behavioral effects. But we have some promising avenues to tackling misinformation, at least among some audiences. There's still many unanswered questions, partly because we have considerable biases in the field towards certain countries, for example, Anglophone countries. And we have too little research in Switzerland and from Switzerland on mediated climate change communication. What we do have is a number, we have quite a few colleagues and centers doing applied research. So actually trying to put their research to use to actually change public perceptions of climate change and try to trigger and initiate actions like the Monash Research Hub that I've shown you, like the Climate Outreach Initiative in Oxford, or like Klimafakten in Germany. That's it from my side. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope I wasn't too long and we have still some time for questions. Yeah, and I'm looking forward to them, and I'm looking forward to the entire day and to your presentations in the following hours. Thank you.